You may have to fight a battle more than once to win it. Margaret Thatcher. There's something about starting over that can feel oddly right. New plan, clean slate. You tell yourself, this time it's going to be different. You've got more clarity, better timing, maybe even a better reason behind it. And for a moment, it actually feels true. You reorganize things. You reset the schedule. You tighten up whatever slipped before. There's a sense of control again, like you're back in it. Because it doesn't just feel like you're starting. It feels like you're correcting something. Like you're getting back to who you're supposed to be. But then somewhere along the way, it fades. It just starts to feel a little heavier, a little less clear. The urgency drops off. The structure loosens. And what started clean starts to feel normal again. And instead of continuing through it, you circle back. You reset again. And it doesn't feel like you're quitting. That's the tricky part. It feels like effort. It feels like responsibility. It feels like you're staying engaged. But if you zoom out, you're not actually building anything. You're just really good at beginning. But most people don't realize how convincing the beginning can be. Even your thinking changes. You're more intentional, more aware. And it's easy to look at that and say, this is working. But what's actually changed? Not much yet. There's no real proof, no track record, no consistency behind it. You start to associate that state, the clarity, the reset, the I'm dialed in again with progress itself. Like the moment you decide to begin is the same as moving forward. But it's not. It just feels like it is. Because starting gives you something most other phases don't. It gives you relief. Relief from whatever was slipping. Relief from knowing you weren't showing up the way you said you would. So when you restart, you're not just taking action. You're removing pressure. And that's where it gets a little deceptive. Because now the reward is tied to the decision to begin, not the work that follows. So you can feel productive without actually producing anything. And over time, that wires something in. You start chasing that feeling, not consciously, but it's there. So every time things start to feel off or messy or less clear, your instinct isn't to keep going through it. It's to go back to where it felt right, back to the beginning. And it's not that most people are avoiding the goal. If anything, they care about it more than they want to admit. That's why they keep coming back to it. That's why they keep restarting. There's something there that matters. But what gets avoided isn't the outcome. It's the stretch in between. That middle part where nothing feels new anymore, where you're not getting the same energy you had at the start, where the structure is there, but it's not fulfilling you the same way. It gets less rewarding. You're still doing the work, but it doesn't feel like progress in the same way. You're not getting that same sense of clarity or control. Now it just feels repetitive. And that's usually where the questions start. Is this still working? Am I doing this right? Should this feel better than it does? Nothing is necessarily wrong, but it doesn't feel as right as it did in the beginning. And that gap, that drop in feeling, is enough to make people hesitate. Because now it requires something different. Not intensity, not a better plan. It requires staying with something when it's no longer interesting. When it's not giving you anything back right away. That's the part we don't like to talk about. Because it's not impressive. It's not exciting. It's just steady. And if you're used to measuring progress by how it feels, that middle can look like something's off. So instead of pushing through it, or even just staying with it, you step away from it. Not completely. You don't walk away from the goal. You just circle back to where it felt clearer, where it felt like you had it again, back to the beginning. And it's easy to say you're avoiding the work, but that's not really what's happening. You're not stepping away from the goal. You didn't lose interest in it. If anything, it stays in the back of your mind the whole time. You think about it, you revisit it, you keep telling yourself you're going to lock back in. So the goal isn't the problem. It's what shows up after the beginning wears off. Because early on, everything feels aligned. You've got clarity, you've got structure, you've got that sense that you're moving in the right direction. But then the routine settles in. And once it settles, it starts to feel ordinary. The same actions over and over. The same effort without much change. Less feedback, less momentum, less emotion tied to it. And that's where things start to shift because it stops giving you that same return. So now you're in a different kind of phase, one where the work doesn't feel rewarding in the moment, where you don't get the same sense of progress from just showing up. And that can be uncomfortable in a way that's hard to explain. Because you're still doing what you said you would do. It just doesn't feel like it's working the same way. That's usually where people start pulling back. They loosen things up, miss a deadline, skip a day. And once that happens, it becomes harder to step back into that same flow. So instead of continuing through something that now feels uncertain, they go back to something that feels clear. They reset. The middle section no longer feels like enough to stick with it. On the other hand, it usually doesn't fall apart in a big moment. It's something small. You don't follow through the way you said you would. On its own, it's nothing. It's a break in the pattern, not the end of it. But it doesn't feel that way. Because when it happens, the focus changes. It's no longer about what you've been doing. It's about what that moment means. And that's where your pattern begins to repeat. You start reading into it. Here we go again. This is what I do. Now it's not a single action. It's a reflection of you. And once it becomes that, sticking with it feels different. Because picking it back up doesn't just mean doing the work again. It means doing it while carrying that thought with you. The thought that you've already broken it, that it's not clean anymore, that whatever you had going isn't what it was. So instead of picking back up where you were, you start thinking about how to fix it. And fixing it usually doesn't look like continuing. It looks like starting over, getting back to that version of yourself that hadn't slipped yet, because that version feels more reliable. But the mistake wasn't what broke it. It was the meaning you attached to it. Because now you're not responding to the action. You're responding to what you believe it says about you. And that's what pulls you further away from it. However, there's another layer that's a little harder to see. Restarting doesn't just reset the plan. It resets how you see yourself. When you begin again, you step right back into that version of you that's disciplined, focused, and locked in. The version that has it together. And that matters more than people realize. Because as long as you're starting, you can still believe that's who you are. You haven't had to prove it yet, but you also haven't disproven it. You're still aligned with the idea of it. But the longer you stay involved with something, the more that gets tested. Not in big ways, in small ways. Did you show up when it was inconvenient? Did you follow through when it felt unimportant? Did you stay consistent when no one would have known if you didn't? That's where the gap starts to show. Between who you think you are and what your actions are actually saying about you. And that's uncomfortable. Because now it's not about intention anymore. It's about evidence. So instead of staying in that space and let it sharpen you, it's easier to step out of it to reset. Because the moment you restart, that tension goes away. You're back in alignment with your intentions. Back to being someone who's about to do it right, and it feels right again. But that feeling comes at a cost, because every time you reset to protect how you see yourself, you delay the moment where you actually become that person. It's easy to look at your efforts and say you've been trying. And in a way, you have. You've shown up at the beginning more times than most people are willing to. You've reset, recalibrated, stepped back in. There's no shortage of intent behind it. But intent doesn't compound. Starting doesn't build on itself. What actually builds is what happens after it stops feeling new, after the structure fades a little, after the clarity isn't as sharp, after you've already had a moment that could have taken you out of it. That's the part that usually gets counted, because it doesn't feel like a turning point. It just feels like continuing. And maybe that's why it gets overlooked, because there's nothing dramatic about it. Nothing that signals this is where it changes. It's just a quiet decision to stay with something as it is. And if you look at it that way, it starts to shift what matters. Not how many times you've gotten back to the starting line, but how often you've stayed just past the point where it would have been easier to go back there. As always, thanks for spending a few minutes with me. Until next time, stay sharp, stay grounded, and keep showing up.